The agricultural sector, though, now accounts for barely 2% of the GDP. Only 7.5% of the total workforce is in agriculture now. Agricultural incomes are falling compared to urban incomes, and young people especially are leaving farming. The average age of farmers is increasing. Most young people don't want to stay in farming. It's not an attractive way of life for most people. And you can deduce the reasons for that. So the big question for Taiwan is who will do the farming in the future, and what's going to happen? Oh, question?
Import labor? Import labor.
Import labor, yes, that's one possibility. Yes, certainly. It's a possibility. It's a possibility. Well, currently your government, I raised that question because I wanted to use that as a lead into this issue here. Your government currently has a Rural Revitalization Act that's pending. Very controversial. They want to spend $200 billion to help the 4,000 farming and fishing villages and 600,000 farming fishing households around the island. And the critics are, what they basically want to do is spend that money to spruce up these villages with new roads and houses and plant trees and prettify them, make them look pretty and attractive. So that the hope is the young people won't want to leave farming. They'll stay because it's a nice, pleasant area in which to live. But the critics complain this is just a cosmetic measure. It doesn't address the underlying root problem of agriculture. That is, farming is not profitable. You cannot earn a living from farming. That's the more serious issue. And that's what critics are fussing about. They say raise farm incomes and people will stay on the farms and renovate the villages themselves. It's better that the people living there do that rather than the government artificially step in and do this. So this is one of the current controversies in Taiwan, and I don't know where this is going to go. Yes, sir?
Is vertical farming possible?
Is what?
Is vertical farming possible?
Vertical farming. What are you referring to as vertical farming?
That means build a sky tower to raise food.
Oh, you mean on physical structures built by people?
To raise food in them.
Well, I don't know. Technically, I suppose it is possible, but that's not a solution for Taiwan, in my opinion. For one thing, because there's so much fallow land now, the agricultural land in Taiwan is not being used. There's a large amount not being used, yet you're importing more food every year. Doesn't that seem a little bit illogical? Huh? Doesn't it? So how do you get people to want to grow food on the land you already have? This is the issue facing the government. And the solution to that, of course, is, as they say, you have to make it profitable to grow crops, to farm. One solution, this is a complex issue. We don't have time to go into a long debate on this, but one of the critical parts of it is the farms are too small. And the government already has, the COA, Council of Agriculture, already has a program to encourage farmers to buy up other farms. This used to be illegal in Taiwan. Strict controls on farm sizes. But now they're making it possible for farmers to buy other farms, to consolidate and build up larger farms. You get economies of scale when you have a larger land area so that your costs come down, and therefore, theoretically, it can become possible to make a profit. But most farmers in Taiwan who are still in farming, that's not their main occupation. Most of them have part-time jobs outside. It's a unique characteristic of agriculture this is true of South Korea, Japan, Taiwan. It's occurring now even in the mainland. These small farming systems, unfortunately, are all plagued, troubled by these same problems. The farms are too small. Prices are not high enough to generate enough revenue to make farming a money-earning operation where you can actually live off of food production. So it becomes a pastime. So you have all that fallow land, and the people don't sell the land because they hold on to it for security. So you have to make it desirable for them to sell their land to other farmers who do want to farm. So it's very complicated. Well, one of the possibilities that to propose, I just want to comment about this briefly, is organic farming and ecotourism. These are two new trends, very much related, though, to the environmental movement, because organic farming is seen by its proponents, those who like organic farming. They see this as a definite part of the solution. A very environmentally friendly form of agriculture, where you minimize use of artificial chemicals and expensive machinery. It's labor intensive, supposedly very healthy, pure kind of agriculture. The crops are very clean. In Taiwan, the initial experiments began in 1987. Don't you find it interesting? All of these new things started in 1987. You see, very closely related to the political changes here. Commercial production started in 1995, and the government standards were first issued in 1999. So it's just 10 years old, barely, you see. So it's in its infancy, just beginning to grow in Taiwan. It's much better developed in Europe. That's where organic farming is a big thing. The United States, it's really taking off in the United States too. But see, it's only a tiny amount, 2,356 hectares. 0.29%, not even about a third of 1% of the farmland in Taiwan is currently in organic farming. They hope to increase that, double it by 2013, but still it won't be that much. But it is a start. It is a start. Rice farmers in Taiwan have started to join this. They were worried after the WTO joined, Taiwan joined the WTO, that rice farmers could not compete with imported rice. And one way they've learned how to compete is to not compete on quality, rather compete on quality, but not on price. And that was the beginning of the organic rice production. In other words, ordinary rice produced in Taiwan is not competitive commercially. But producing these high-value organic rices is one way to meet this need. Well, this is just some facts about the organic movement here. I don't know if any of you have bothered to search for or consume organic rice, but supposedly it's superior to regular rice, but it's a tiny fraction of the total rice grown so far. But it's beginning to find a niche, and they're even starting to export some of these gourmet rices to other countries. And it's conceivable in the decades ahead that this will take off and provide a niche for Taiwan farmers. And indeed, this seems to be a major possibility for many Taiwan farmers, finding niche markets for rice, for Taiwan's superb fruits, for example. You have wonderful fruits in Taiwan, very high quality. And these are often competitive in not only domestically, of course, but internationally. And the government is trying to encourage that trend in agriculture. And then, I bring in the example of Hualien has been one area of Taiwan that's been particularly active in producing environmentally friendly agriculture, non-toxic agriculture, they call it. Started in 2004. There's not much industry, of course, over in Hualien, that big county in the east. Farming is much more important, so they felt a need to do this. And so they're getting into this eco-friendly, non-toxic agriculture, combining it with eco-farming, they call it, where they open up their farms to visitors. Have any of you gone to an eco-farm, by the way? Huh? Some of you have? Yeah. I visited some. I remember going to the Flying Cow Ranch. Have you gone there too? It's apparently quite famous in Miaoli, isn't it? Yes. Yeah, very interesting experiment in ecotourism, eco-farming. The farming operation goes on, but they bring in visitors from the cities, or foreign visitors for that matter, and you can get a glimpse of farm life, supposedly, of Taiwan. You pay money for it, of course, and you buy their food and their products, and it provides a supplement, thus, you see, to the farm income. It's one way also of bridging the gap between the urban dwellers and the rural dwellers, because so many young people, younger people like you, who have never grown up on a farm, don't really know what farm life is like, do you? This is a common problem in America. People have no idea where their food comes from. I think it's very healthy, very good idea for people to experience where their food comes from and see what rural life is like. And if that'll help the farmers stay in business, great. So these are all in their infancy, but it's a very promising trend for Taiwan and for agriculture. This is one other example that has been talked about a lot in the press recently. Huashan Village in Gukang Township, over in Yunlin County on the west coast. What they've done, they were devastated by the 9/21 earthquake, and they were wondering, what can we do to revive our poor village? Really a small town, 35,000. And so they decided to go back to the future, that's what I call it. Way back in the Japanese era, at the turn of the century, the Japanese started growing coffee there. And it sort of petered out over the decades after the war. And now they're trying to revive that culture and that product. So they're replanting coffee trees. And it's now become a main coffee growing center for Taiwan. And with ecotourism, they bring in visitors. They have an annual coffee festival. I have not been to it yet. Has anybody? It just started in 2002. But supposedly it's quite nice. They get a lot of visitors there. 1 million were recorded each year. Mostly local visitors from Taiwan. But that's just one example. There could be many, many opportunities, you see, on this ecotourism bandwagon. So this has a promising air to it also. So the bottom line is a healthy agricultural sector is essential to sustainable development. And Taiwan's government has a National Sustainable Development Council. That is their aim. It's a high-ranking branch of the within the executive yuan to advise the government on the entire realm of the development of Taiwan, how to achieve a sustainable development system in Taiwan. Extremely difficult to achieve, extremely complicated. My colleague, Professor Zhang Jiangyi, has participated in that. It's a very, very difficult thing to achieve, but essential in the long run. Let's go up to the mountains, okay? Part 2, development of mountain regions. When I first came to Taiwan, on one of my field trips, this would have been in the 1970s, I first came in 69, I think maybe it was 70 or 71 when I first did that. Took the bus from Taichung up over the mountains on the new Cross Island Highway over to Taroko Gorge to Hualien, like many tourists do. And I was intrigued by what was going on up in the high mountain country, the level of development. Over the succeeding years, Professor Zhang and I thought about this and visited it a number of times. And when I came back, and this would be in 79, I came back for a sabbatical leave here at Taida. He and I embarked upon an intensive study of the first Cross Island Highway and the Upper Daja Basin in the high mountains and what has happened there. And I wanted to present some of those findings and how that ties in with environmental protection of particularly the high mountain country of Taiwan. This is the map I showed you the first half of the hour. It looks vastly better now, doesn't it? Now you can actually see it. And you see the 39% one, that's the high mountain country, this big area in the eastern half of the island where the highest mountains are located. And there's the road system, and then highlighted are the Cross Island highways. The one we're going to focus on here is the first Cross Island Highway right here. Taichung is over here, Hualien here. There's Taipei up there. This was the first one built in the 50s, but later on they added one up here that connects with this spur in Ilan, and they put the southern Cross Island Highway over here down in Taidung. And they had plans originally for other Cross Island highways. There was going to be one through the central portion, very close to Yushan, Mount Yu, in what is today Yushan National Park. Environmentalists got them to drop that idea, and they've abandoned any others. But you can see there are other spur roads that go into the mountains, even though they don't actually go over the mountains. There's been a massive invasion of the mountain country of Taiwan in the last several decades. Feeder roads going in for various kinds of development purposes, logging, agriculture, hotels and tourism and so on. and it's had some devastating effects in many cases. But the first, or Central Cross-Island Highway, as it's called, had a number of objectives. Because, I guess we need to go back. Before these roads were built, just to remind you, here's Hualien. There was no way to get to Hualien, as I said in the first part of the period, except by this narrow, mountainous, twisting road along the cliffs, the Suao Hualien Road here, to get to Hualien that the Japanese had carved out during their era. But it was very, very slow and difficult, and to get to Hualien was a good part of the day to travel there. Now you can get there in 2.5 hours if you speed on the highway, and the traffic is not too bad. Professor Zhang is a very fast driver, and we get there in 2.5 hours easily. So you can make it in record time now. It's so simple. But it wasn't always that way, believe me. And there was no rail connection, of course, around either of the ends of the island. So the government in the 1950s, faced with, keep in mind the political system again, the situation, communist threat from China, having to build up Taiwan and to marshal all the resources of Taiwan, they saw it highly desirable at that time to link up the East Coast with the West by roads and to open up the interior to development and settlement. This was seen as a good thing at that time. And so the highway had a variety of specific objectives. Link the West Coast with the East, that was the first one. Enable development of hydropower. They could tap into these very fast-flowing rivers up in the high mountains where the slope is very steep. So that's a good, theoretically, that's a good location for hydropower generation, building of dams. They could develop tourism in the high mountains. Most visitors could never get up there. It's too remote and difficult, except for backpackers. So most people would never see that beautiful country. And also they discovered they could promote high elevation temperate agriculture. You're in the subtropics here in the lowlands. Many crops won't grow here, will they? Up in those higher elevations you have much cooler temperatures, so things that grow in my country, North America, the United States, could be grown up in those mountains. And you had a lot of military in Taiwan. Here again, the political military system. They came over with the government in 49, and as those military, mostly mainland soldiers retired, what do you do with them? Where do you put them? They have to be done. They have to do something with them. They have to be given a way of living, and so this whole system would provide jobs for retired military. And lastly, you had the Aborigines living up there. The government ostensibly wanted to modernize them, assimilate them, bring them into the modern society of Taiwan and give them economic opportunities. The roads would provide access. So, in principle, this sounds like a great idea, doesn't it? In principle. And so it was widely touted in the 50s and 60s, in that growth era. Anything is possible era. Now, 50 years later, most people, certainly all environmentalists, look back and say, this was one of the worst decisions the government could have made for the long-range environmental health of Taiwan. This is a typical picture of the lower slopeland zone. That is the margin where the plain meets the mountains from about 100 to 500 meters elevation. There's a belt that goes all the way around the island, of course, around the mountain interior, that looks much like this, where that land has long been cultivated and used for various things, for agriculture and all sorts of things. Some good, some bad. Most of it spontaneous, most of it illegal. But thousands and thousands of hectares of land that had been cultivated, going back even into the Japanese era. So the government, after 1950, started a program for slopeland development. Since the farmers are already there, the government reasoned, well, why don't we go in then and help the farmers use this land more efficiently, more conservatively, to stop soil erosion and make them more productive, raise their incomes. That all sounds good and reasonable, right? And so They started off these programs of, as you can see here, building terraces and access roads with heavy machinery and lots of government personnel from the government agriculture departments and others to simply bring order, you could say, to the lower slopeland zone of the mountains. And these are a variety of pictures. I've visited so many of these projects over the decades. These are just a random sampling from some of the many, many pictures I took. But you can see here a moderate slopeland elevation here with terraces put in and the land cleared off and getting ready for cultivation of one sort or another. This is more typical of the random kind that the farmers do, almost like old-fashioned slash and burn agriculture, where they just crudely clear off a patch of land and plant stuff in there. So a few trees, fruit trees or something. And you'll see patches like that all over. Haven't you noticed, have you had any chance to travel at all around the island as you go down the highways? If it's clear enough, if you're close enough to the slopelands, you can see a kind of a patchwork quilt pattern. Vegetation at different levels of growth. And some of those are very old cultivated areas. Some are more recent, and so the vegetation is at different heights, different kinds of vegetation. Very patchwork pattern. Mixed land use, we call it. And that's a reflection of decades of changing agriculture use by farmers. Here, you see? Very typical like this. You see a mix of everything. Mix of everything. Pineapples, banana palms, and especially, do you see these trees right here, these palm trees right here? Do you recognize what those are? This is one of the worst of the species grown on the slopelands from an environmental viewpoint. Do any of you chew betel nuts? Have you heard of the betel nuts? Huh? You've heard of it, haven't you? You can see these for sale around the urban areas, usually by young women wearing very little clothing. You know, this is part of traditional Taiwanese culture. The betel nut palm. It's the second most widely cultivated crop in Taiwan after rice. Yeah. Millions of dollars in revenues. You see this typically workers, rural dwellers. I mean, this is the facts. Usually associated with people with lesser education. They chew the betel nut. It's loosely equivalent to tobacco chewing in America. All right? And the betel nut is a mild narcotic. It gives a high to the, I'm told, I've never chewed it, but it's supposed, I've heard it's supposed to give you a mild high, mild narcotic effect, and it's a habit, like chewing tobacco. And so this has become an ingrained part of very old, traditional, rural Taiwanese culture, and the government simply cannot root it out. They've tried to encourage it and change it, but it's very hard to change people's habits. It's like trying to get Americans to give up smoking. But these trees they have very shallow roots, and they're very hard on the environment, and the government would like the farmers to get rid of the betel nuts and plant something else that is better for slopeland cultivation. But anyway, this is a very typical slopeland pattern. Here's another one. Look how steep that slope is. Look at that. Crude. You can make out the faint outlines of very crude terracing. Not very good. This is more gentle sloping. These are pineapples, by the way. A lot of my pictures were taken back in the 70s and 80s when pineapple production was much higher in Taiwan. That was one of the big fruits promoted through the 80s. By the 90s, Taiwan pineapples started to lose their competitiveness to foreign pineapples, and production then started to decline. But there's still a lot of pineapple grown, but nothing like it was before. And sometimes, can you guess what this is? This is pasture land. Do you see cattle? See, beef cattle. The dairy industry grew in Taiwan. And so slopelands were used to raise dairy cattle. And then here is a newly planted, these are pineapples you see here over here. And there's a dividing line here, and then there's terraces over here with young fruit trees, you see, planted. And on the face of the slope of each terrace, they've put a ground cover, and that's a soil erosion control measure. But still, just common sense tells you, you look at that, a typhoon comes through with like 1,000 millimeters of rain in 24 hours maybe. Even those terraces aren't going to last, are they? You're going to have some soil erosion. Easily eroded. Or look at this. Raw, newly terraced, newly planted ground. Very prone to erosion if a heavy rainstorm, let alone a typhoon, comes by. Or here. These are all government schemes, you see, where they've put in these plantings trying to bring order to the lower slopeland zone and help farmers control erosion. Totally noble objectives, but fraught with all kinds of dangers. Look at this. This is tea. This is one of the poor tea, one of the worst examples of tea cultivation that we found. You see? Those terraces are very erosive. Here's a better one. You can see here, very healthy looking tea bushes, and you see, it's a very labor intensive activity. You see, they've used stones to face the front of the terrace, you see, to try to control the erosion. That's very difficult, very expensive. Oops, went wrong direction, sorry. So, when you get up into the high mountain country now, which is where we want to head, then it gets even more problematic. We saw this photo crudely in the first part of the period, but this gets more difficult. What can you do up here? What are the possibilities? Well, here, look at the steepness, the ruggedness of the landscape. You would think the best thing to do with this kind of environment is just leave it alone, don't touch it, right? And that's what environmentalists would say, at least preservationists, those who opt for no human development whatsoever of high slopelands. Preservationist philosophy is nice in theory. It just won't work in Taiwan. There's too many people and too much pressure. You have to be more realistic. Conservation is the more realistic option here. Manage these lands prudently, carefully, but you have to realize that some human intervention is going to be necessary. Anyway, the Cross Island Highway was built. These are just a random selection of some of the photos I've taken over the years, but that's what it looks like. Now, the road has been closed since 1999 for the total length, the complete length. So I imagine none of you have had the opportunity. I don't know if any of you are native Taiwanese, if you got up there and managed to take the trip over before 1999. Did any of you do that? Huh? Nobody in this room has been over, done the actual journey. Okay. Well, when it was possible, before 1999, the 9/21 earthquake, which closed the highway, it took a full day to get from Hualien through Taroko Gorge, up over the pass, down to the west coast, presumably going to Taichung or wherever. And that would include usually a lunch break up at the Lishan area where the tourists congregate. But it was an interesting trip, very interesting trip. I called it a thrill ride, simply because of the, as you can see, it's a road literally carved into the side of extremely steep mountainsides. In some places, slopes of 60 degrees. There are very few places in America where you find mountain roads on terrain that bad. The nearest thing that comes to my mind, have any of you driven Highway 1 in California? Are you Americans, by the way, or not? No. Okay, you're not. I don't know. Are any Americans here? Huh? Have you ever driven Highway 1 in America, in California? You have. Yeah, that's kind of a thrill ride too, isn't it?
Yeah,
definitely. Big Sur, right? Exactly, because it goes along sheer cliffs like that, and similar to that. Yeah, but this goes for a long, long distance, and it goes through this beautiful countryside. You're above the tree line in some of the places here, so in the winter you'll get snow. And this is the kind of scenery you would see on that Cross Island Highway. So you can see why they saw tourism as a big opportunity here. I mean, no question, it's beautiful country. It's breathtakingly beautiful. Sort of reminds me, again by analogy, the Grand Teton or Glacier National Park in Montana. comes to mind. If you've ever driven up to Glacier National Park in northern Montana, scenery something like this. You see, there's the road, all right? See? Twists and lines. This is up at one of the summits. There's the road. Here you can see, particularly one of the more scary parts of it, but again, we're not getting the full slide effect here, unfortunately, but it coils around the road. You see, look at the steepness of that slope. And this one is virtually bare of vegetation, so you can imagine the risk of landslides on a slope like this. More than 200 people died, by the way. Servicemen died while building this highway from 1956 to 1960, opened in 1960. And there's that same highway at a different time, but that's why I say that's a pretty scary ride. But it was the main road across the mountains of Taiwan for quite a long time until they built the other highway in a couple decades later. There's Yushan, Snowy Mountain, the highest point in the upper Dajia Valley. That is now part, of course, of Shueba National Park, one of the newer national parks, which is on the other side of the Dajia River. Well, in 1973, the road opened in 1960. 1973, 13 years later, they finished the Diji Dam at the entrance to the upper Dajia River Valley, and that's the dam as it looked. And of course, then it filled up a reservoir, the Diji Reservoir behind it. That's the dam from the reservoir side looking downstream, all right? You can see the ruggedness of this landscape up here. Very, very challenging. But one of their objectives was to provide employment for retired servicemen and experiment with temperate agriculture. And so they built the first of some 13 state farms run by the government, run for the benefit of retired servicemen. This is the one at Fushoshan, which is on a spur of the road right above the Diji Reservoir, occupying a relatively gently sloping top of a spur of the mountain. And they opened up all this land, and several hundred retired servicemen became farmers. It's kind of a combination collective private farming operation, a very peculiar enterprise. There's another close-up of that. And here they're growing a combination, this was at the height of their production, growing a variety of temperate vegetables. Cabbage is a big thing up here. It grows very well up here. You get magnificent cabbages. But also apples, oranges, peaches. Not oranges, I'm sorry. Apples, pears, and peaches, I meant to say. And a variety of vegetables. They even built a summer home for Chiang Kai-shek, which is now open to tourists. This is where he would come to cool off in the hotter weather, presumably. Fairly modest house that he liked to visit. Looks down over the valley, over the reservoir. But there's the Diji Reservoir, you see, down there. What they didn't count on, of course, was... Can we shut that door? It's a little bit noisy out there. What they didn't count on, though, was the unintended consequences of doing this. And anybody can tell you this. When you put in a road anywhere, transportation access is the catalyst that opens up a territory, a region, to other things. And unless you have strict land control laws for the land in there, other people are going to follow once you put in a road. The government will put this in for the benefit of providing, you see, employment for the servicemen, testing temperate crop cultivation. They had no idea that so many mainlanders would follow that. Mainlanders and Taiwanese would follow them from the lowlands of Taiwan. Taiwanese settlers, farmers. And what happened was, people flocked to this area. Here was a new economic opportunity up in the slopeland zone. And Fushoshan was a big success. They said, well, if they can do it, why can't we? And so they just somewhat rather indiscriminately started opening up all these slopelands. This is taken from Fushoshan, looking down onto the reservoir, and spontaneous settlement and development took place. Thousands of settlers moved into this area. And by 1980, that's not quite 10 years later, after the dam was built, there was around 50,000 people living in this valley. That's a huge population number for a high mountain environment, ecosystem like this. It was largely confined to the south side of the river. This is the river, the reservoir right here. On the north side, because there was no road access to the north side initially, that was left in forest cover. And today, this is the boundary line. This is Xueba National Park today. It's preserved, and on this side you have all of this settlement, development, and farming going on. Interesting contrast, how a river and a divide and lack of transport access can limit the use of that land on the other side. That's getting a little bit closer. Oh, by the way, here's examples. These are old landslide scars, you see. You'll see these everywhere in the high mountain countries from various eras, various ages when landslides have occurred. But you see, massive terracing hillsides. Let's move through these quickly or I'll run out of time again. I tend to ramble on, I'm sorry. They wanted to help the Aborigines. This is Huanshan, one of the Aboriginal communities up here. As it looked in the 70s, and more, and then later, I think this was taken in the 80s, I believe. And then this is one we took just recently. And of course, I think we lost it, I guess, but there's the Christian church here. Many of these Aborigines are converted to Christianity. And this is one we took just last year when Professor Zhang and I went up for another look-see to see how things were going. So the village is still there, still prospering, and the agriculture cultivation still goes on. But to summarize the unintended consequences, you had soil erosion, landslides, siltation of the reservoir. You had an impact on the Aborigines. Ostensibly, you were trying to help the Aborigines, and some of them did prosper from the growing of these fruits, like apples and pears and so on. But many people were criticizing this, whether you were in fact exploiting the Aborigines rather than protecting them. More importantly, for Taiwan as a whole, was the impact on public attitudes and the question, whose land is this up there? The land laws in Taiwan are very complicated, very confused, poorly enforced, and so it's quite easy for people to use land illegally. And so much of that cultivation you just saw on those hillsides is illegal. Squatters, in effect. Or people who have illegally leased land from Aborigines, mainlanders who have, lowlanders, Taiwanese or mainlanders, who have leased land illegally from their Aborigines and are engaged in fruit cultivation or crop cultivation of one kind or another. So massive spontaneous settlement by lowlanders. This is a land use map we did in the 80s. It's too complicated for you to see it here, but it just gives you an idea of the immense opening up. It's what used to be basically just all forest land, now a very complex pattern of different kinds of land uses in the upper valley, but overwhelmingly most of it on the southeast side of the Dajia River, which flows up the center of the valley. And right over here now, this is all part of Xueba National Park. So quickly, just go through a few slides to show you what these slopeland farms look like more close up. Here's look at the steep slopes. You see these little farmhouses dotted here and there. Again, slopes of 45 to 60 degrees, very common with these terraced farms. The recommended agronomists, agricultural experts, recommend you not use slopes greater than 28 degrees for slopeland cultivation. They're farming land here as steep as 60 degrees, which they've cut into very, very narrow terraces. There's a group of houses, you see. Look at this one here. Look how steep that slope is. And you can see the terraces, step-like terraces, carved into these hillsides. Getting closer there, you see. They try to, the more responsible ones will put in rock facing to try to stabilize these terraces, minimize erosion. There you can, look how steep that is. Look at that. Sometimes that doesn't work, though. Here's an example of one of those where erosion has washed away many of the terraces, you see. Very common. Or this one, look how steep that is. Unfortunately, the slide runs off here. Right up here is a tiny little shed, a house, sitting up there on this rather scraggly, very rocky looking slope. But they've planted fruit trees here. Here's a newly developed one. You see? This is an alluvial fan in the valley where it's relatively flatter, and that's long been under intensive cultivation for vegetables particularly. Here's a close-up. There you can see the rock facing on the terraces, you see? That's more responsible cultivation, although it's still much too steep. And then to support these fruit trees, they erect these elaborate bamboo scaffoldings to support the trees, because the fruit is very heavy when it matures, and the limbs would break, especially if storms come through. So very labor intensive. They, by hand, build all of these elaborate bamboo scaffoldings all over the hillsides. Thousands of hectares. There's a close-up. You see? Red delicious apples growing up there. The next time you eat an apple in the market, good chance if it wasn't imported, it came from here. There are a lot of imported fruits now, of course. There's a close-up of one of these apples. But particularly before, this is all before WTO now, 2002. So there were there wasn't much imported fruit at that time. So these apples and pears and peaches commanded premium prices in the market. We did a measurement and surveyed the farmers, and we found that the average fruit farmer up there, back in the early 80s, was getting an average annual income of $29,000 a year, which was way above the average per capita income of Taiwan at that time. So it was a very lucrative enterprise. You can see why so many people wanted to go into it. Now, that is no longer as extreme as it was then, but it's still profitable enough that fruit farming goes on here to this very day, because they can still make good money growing these fruits and vegetables up there. Here's a water reservoir for irrigation purposes and other uses, you see. And drainage systems they put in. I'm just going quickly here. You can see farmers carrying fertilizer and stuff up these steep hillsides. Very labor intensive, hard work on these steep slopes. Siltation of the reservoir. This is a big problem that developed as these hillsides started to erode. Look at the alluvium collecting in the reservoir. Oh, that's not it. Sorry. What happened? Oh. We lost something. What happened? I'm not sure how we jumped ahead like that. Let me get back. Okay, here's the town of Lishan. Just give me a quick glance here. Here's the tourism center, Lishan. You can still get up here from, if you come from the east, from Hualien. But the big tourist buses aren't allowed anymore. You have to come by smaller vehicles. But the tourist center, hotels and whatnot developed up here. You see? Hotels, lodges, various kinds. The government built a Chinese-style hotel that I stayed in. It was very nice, but it's since closed down now and gone out of business. There it is. This is a big stop on the tourist route in Taiwan for visitors from abroad. And the town of Lishan, fruit market there. Well, to get to the crux of the issue, the environmental issue, I call this nature's revenge because we had the earthquake in September 1999, of course. That closed the highway. There were massive landslides. So the highway was closed from Lishan all the way down to the lower reaches of the river. So the government invested millions of dollars in the years after the earthquake to rebuild the road and open it up. And ironically, in the summer of 2004, early summer, they were going to have the grand reopening of the Cross Island Highway. And then Typhoon Mindu came in July 2004, and it washed out all of those repairs that they had just completed from the earthquake of 1999. And that, what wasn't washed out was hit by Typhoon Eri, I'm not sure how you pronounce that, that came along in August, a month later, Those two typhoons were sort of the coup de grace, we say, the final blow that effectively nixed the chance of rebuilding the Cross Island Highway. So you had closing of the Cross Island Highway, and it has remained closed to this day in terms of going all the way across from the Diji area down to Guguan, which is further downstream. That piece is completely closed. And the controversy is whether or not they should rebuild it. Here's one of the landslides you see where they're trying to reopen it after the earthquake. But there were hundreds of these landslides along the route. Here is this was taken just last year, though. The cultivation still goes on. It's just very hard for the farmers now. They can't send their produce to the west. They have to send everything to the east through either Hualien or up to Ilan and then around to Taipei and the west coast. So their transport costs are higher. But they can still make a profit, and thus they still do it. It's just not as profitable as they used to be. And Lishan is still there, but this old hotel is crumbling away. It's not maintained. But you still find the fruit markets. But the level of tourism is definitely down because you can no longer make the whole trip all the way around, all the way across. And tourists don't like, it's a arduous journey by road. You go down to Hualien, up through Taroko, through that very tortuous road up to the summit. But then you have to go right back down the same way. So you can't go on to Taichung directly, and it's inconvenient. It's not as much fun. And so a lot of tourists just don't bother to do it anymore. Even the locals don't do it as frequently. This is inside Shuiba National Park, some of the tourist developments there. Well, this is the, Professor Lin just last week showed me the latest 3D imagery of this area. I just wanted to show this to you quickly. This is a GIS satellite imagery of the area, and we produced these very hurriedly, so I'd have them been ready in time for today's class. So they're not completely rectified, and so there's some distortion in it, but you can see this is the Diji Dam here, this is the Diji Reservoir, and then the river flows on downstream this way. And the big change, of course, is there, as a result of Morakot, there were a lot more landslides into the reservoir, although it wasn't hit as hard as the areas further to the south in Kaohsiung and over in Taitung. But the reservoir, nonetheless, has been silted up a lot more. The water used to be a beautiful blue-green, and now it's gotten kind of a muddy, milky color, indicating a much higher level of silt. The Diji Dam is no longer operable, and because of Morakot. And they're saying that to dredge the reservoir and resurrect the dam for hydropower production would be prohibitively expensive. So it's unlikely that they'll be able to use that dam again unless they're willing to spend a very large amount of money. Most environmentalists say don't do that. Here again, one of these newest images, you can see there's the dam and the reservoir from a different angle. And that's cultivation. There's the reservoir again there. And I wanted to show you this particularly because it's an aerial photo of the Fushoshan farm. This is the mainland soldiers' farmstead, which still thrives up there for the time being. We don't know about the future. And there's Lishan, all right, from the air today. The slopeland cultivation, you see, still goes on, but there's the reservoir. See now kind of a milky, muddy mess, and a lot more landslides into it. There's it is again. Lishan, there's Fushoshan up on the top of the hillside above Lishan. And another one of that area. And there's the reservoir again, you see. So, I'm trying to get into this because we're going to run out of time. After 2004, after the road was closed again, public attitudes and government attitudes finally changed here. And they came up with a new philosophy about land use in the island. And these are some of the aspects of it. A more environmentally friendly attitude towards opening up the high mountain lands. Respecting nature, focus on sustainability of policies, promote green development, utilize resources in relationship to the environment, develop regions in an integrated way, return damaged land to its natural state. In other words, trying to reverse the process. And specifically, a national land recovery plan was proposed. It was approved in the executive yuan. This would be under the Chen Shui-bian administration now, you see. It got to the legislature and stalled for political reasons because of the impasse, the political impasse between the pan-blue, which still controlled the legislature then, and the pan-green legislative branch. Executive branch, I'm sorry. But in this plan, they proposed 3 zones that they would classify into different uses for protection. And in the high mountain country, over 1,500 meters, this would be the high elevation protection zone. They would allow no new development. All illegal development would have to be removed. And eventually all legal development also would have to go. That means up in the Daja Valley, that would all have to be turned back to nature. The only exception would be aboriginal developments and special installations. These would be government facilities of some kind. In the medium zone, between 500 and 1,500, new development would be banned. All illegal activity would have to stop, but existing legal operations would be allowed. So that's that intermediate zone where there's already wide-scale development throughout Taiwan, all the way around the middle. And then in the lowest zone, areas between 100 and 500 meters elevation and most coastal land, here the goal would be sustainable development. So land use plans would have to be developed and licensing to control development. But the idea, for the first time in Taiwan's history, was proposing a total island-wide land use planning law, a revolutionary thing in environmental terms. Wonderful in principle, but it stalled, as I say, in the legislature. And because through the second administration of Chen Shui-bian, as you know, all kinds of political troubles occurred with him, culminating in his recent trial. They basically put this on the back burner and just forgot about it, because there was no hope, no chance of this ever getting through the legislature in the second term. Now the question is whether it's going to be passed in this current government. An additional part of this plan was they set aside 8 special categories, one of which included the Upper Daja Valley, and specifically there they were going to have all illegal farms to be removed within 5 years. The legal operations would be taken over by the government and then stopped, of course. They would compensate them for the legal operations. But all of those illegal farms, which is a good proportion of the farming up in that area, would have to stop within 5 years. Mass tourism would end, so Lishan would effectively wither on the vine. It would no longer be a need for the town of Lishan up there. And only ecological tourism would be allowed. The Cross-Island Highway, though, significantly would not be rebuilt, so they would not attempt to rebuild that destroyed section of the road. Very controversial, very challenging. Will that plan be passed? That's the question. Interestingly, I saw in the news a few weeks ago, Ma Ying-jeou came out after Morakot with all the criticism, remember, that was heaped upon him. You know, he got withering criticism, he and his government, for Morakot. And I heard him say, though, publicly, that he said Taiwan needs an island-wide national land use plan. Yay! Many environmentalists shouted with joy, I'm sure, at that. But of course, it's one thing for Ma Ying-jeou to say that, quite another for the whole legislature and the KMT, which dominates it now, to come out and support it, because it's so highly controversial. There are so many special interests involved. There are so many mainlanders, and the KMT, remember, is dominated by mainlanders. There's so many mainlanders who have entrenched economic interests in the upper slopeland zone, specifically the upper Daja Valley. What are the chances of the legislature passing that land use, whether they call it the land recovery plan or not? What are the chances of them passing that now? One wonders. One wants to be optimistic, but I'm not sure. And even if they pass it, how will the government enforce the law? Particularly in controlling the Aborigines. That's another whole issue. We don't have time to go into that now. But the Aborigines in recent years have had a very strong sense of ethnic awakening and are being much more assertive about their land use rights to their native lands in the mountains, and often quarreling, if not protesting and fighting with the government against controls and efforts to reduce their cultivation rights, their hunting rights, where they may live. And now this effort to relocate many of the Aborigines after Morakot. Remember, their villages were destroyed, and they're wanting to relocate some of them. A lot of Aborigines are unhappy about that. So it's very difficult, very, very difficult to get them to cooperate on some of these things. How will the wishes and needs of the Aborigines be accommodated? Very troubling questions that make one, if not pessimistic, doubtful whether this National Land Recovery Plan will be passed. But the trouble is, Taiwan desperately needs this. And Morakot, 4 years, I guess it's 5 years almost, after the typhoons of 2004, and those were 5 years after the 9/21 disaster of the earthquake. What's next? What follows Morakot now? What other blow will it take to convince the government of the need for something like this? This is one of the most critical national island-wide issues facing Taiwan today. Bringing order to their land use policies in such an environmentally fragile island. They desperately need something like this. It may not be exactly like the one in 2004. They might fiddle with it and modify it and improve it in some way, but they need something like this. And that's the big question mark. So if you look at this is the last slide I have, so we're not doing too badly. If you look at Taiwan's environmental experience, these are some of the lessons from Taiwan's experience that one could highlight. First of all, when you do projects like a cross-island highway, say, do a full cost-benefit environmental impact assessment first. That is required by law now, but as Professor Zhang can tell you, who is an authority on the EIA process in Taiwan, there are many ways to get around the laws in Taiwan. And the EIA sometimes are not done, or they're not done carefully, properly, and projects slip by. Oh, I just have to tell you, have you all heard about the gondola project? You know, the gondola that has currently been, what's the Chinese name for it? I can't even remember. What's the Chinese name? The aerial skyway, the gondola, we call it. Yeah. Yeah. That's been closed for over a year now, I understand, because of improper construction. And somehow, because of the nature of the project, I don't know all the details, they didn't have to have an EIA done when they built that. And one wonders if they had done an EIA, would that have gone through? That's just a local, more modest type of project for tourism purposes that illustrate the need for EIA. Have laws, regulations in place to control negative consequences before construction starts, such as the cross-island highway. So make sure you have these ready before the project actually gets underway. And then be prepared to enforce the laws and regs. Taiwan has a very bad record, I'm sorry to say, in enforcing its environmental rules and regulations. And respect the interests of the indigenous peoples, within reason. Within reason. But the indigenous peoples also have to come to recognize that they're part of a larger society. And their interests sometimes may conflict with those of the larger society, and they have to compromise too. And that's a lesson they need to learn, I believe. And above all, undertake projects within plans for sustainable development. The island-wide sustainable development. The land recovery plan would be a significant component of an island-wide sustainable development plan for Taiwan. For further details, see the EPA website. Very interesting website that the EPA has. Very informative. All kinds of information and statistics there where you can see more.